They're suing me for thousands because I saved their baby from a fire. I saved a burning baby from a car wreck, and now her family is suing me because of it. It's one of those sentences that sounds like the setup to a dark joke, not something that actually happens in real life. But it's my life now. Sometimes I lie awake at night, staring at the shadows on my ceiling, the phantom smell of smoke and gasoline in my nose, and I wonder what they would have preferred. If I had just kept walking to my car that day, put in my earbuds, and driven home, blissfully unaware. Would they have preferred a funeral to a lawsuit? Judging by their actions over the last few months, I'm honestly not sure anymore. It all started on a perfectly average Tuesday. I just clocked out from my job as a physical therapist, my muscles humming with that good kind of ache after a long day of helping people learn to walk again. The late afternoon air was thick and hazy with summer heat, the kind that makes the asphalt feel soft under your shoes. I was halfway across the parking lot when I heard it, a horrifying, drawn-out screech of tires that made every hair on my arm stand up, followed by a sickening, final crunch of metal and glass. It was a sound of absolute finality. Across the street, a massive family SUV, the kind that's always plastered with those stick-figure family decals, had wrapped its entire front end around a giant oak tree. It wasn't just a fender bender, the engine was practically sitting in the front passenger seat. Billows of thick, black smoke were already pouring out from under the crumpled hood. For a moment, the world just stopped. People on the sidewalk, drivers in their cars, everyone froze, suspended in that single, silent gasp of shared shock. Then, the driver's side door was flung open and a woman stumbled out. I recognized her vaguely, Tessa. She ran a wildly popular mommy blog called Blessed Mama and was the queen bee of the organic, holistic parenting groups at the local community center. She was the town's icon of perfect motherhood. But right then, she was a wreck. She started screaming, a high, panicked wail that cut through the sudden silence. My baby. My baby's in the car. But she wasn't running towards the car. In a move that my brain still can't quite process, she was running away from it, staggering towards the opposite sidewalk, her phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. Something inside me just broke. I'm not a hero. I'm not brave by any stretch of the imagination. I'm the person who overthinks a text message for 20 minutes. I'm the person who sees a spider and cordons off that entire section of the apartment until someone else can deal with it. But in that moment, none of that mattered. It was like my brain shut off and my body just took over, a primal switch flipping that sent me into fifth gear. The mom clearly wasn't going back. The smoke was getting thicker by the second, and I could hear a faint, terrified crying from inside the wreck. Someone had to do something. I sprinted across the street, the acrid smell of burning oil and hot metal assaulting my senses. I yanked on the handle of the rear passenger door. It was jammed shut from the impact. I pulled again, adrenaline surging through me, giving me a strength I didn't know I possessed, and it wrenched open with a torturous groan of twisted metal. Inside, a little girl, no older than 2, was strapped into her car seat, her face bright red and streaked with tears, her screams now terrifyingly loud. The smoke inside the car was a living thing, thick and choking, and the heat was so intense it felt like it was cooking my eyeballs. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely work the damn buckles on the car seat. It was one of those complicated, 5-point harnesses designed by engineers who clearly hate parents, and in that moment, I hated them too. It's okay, sweetie, it's okay. I kept muttering, the words feeling hollow and useless. Nothing about this was okay. Finally, with a click that sounded like the loudest noise in the world, the release gave way. I scooped the little girl into my arms, her small body trembling like a leaf. I turned to get us out, and that's when a part of the engine exploded. It wasn't a huge Hollywood fireball, just a deafening bang and a concussive wave of heat that felt like opening an oven door directly in my face. Searing, unimaginable pain shot through my right arm and up the side of my neck. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground 10 feet away, instinctively shielding the child with my own body as the SUV became fully engulfed in angry, orange flames. Strangers were suddenly there, pulling us further back, their faces a blur of panic and concern. The hospital was a surreal nightmare of morphine drips, insistent beeping machines, and the cloying, sterile smell of antiseptic. The diagnosis was grim. Third-degree burns across my right arm, my shoulder, and the side of my neck. Part of my ear was just gone. The doctors, with their gentle voices and sad eyes, told me they weren't sure if I'd ever regain full use of my right hand. As a physical therapist, my hands are everything. They're my connection to my patients, my tools, my entire livelihood. The thought of losing that was more terrifying than the fire itself. But the little girl, Bella, was miraculously fine. Not a single scratch on her. A little smoke inhalation, but otherwise, she was perfect. Her mother, Tessa, visited me once. She stood at the foot of my bed, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital room in her designer jeans and expensive-looking blouse. She mumbled a thank you for saving her daughter, her voice flat and distant. Then she leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Listen, she said, I'd really appreciate it if you didn't talk to the media or anyone about the accident. My business, my brand, it just couldn't handle any bad publicity right now. I was so heavily medicated and exhausted that I just nodded, a weak, compliant gesture. All I wanted was to sleep and for her to leave. So I agreed. Looking back, that was my first and most critical mistake. Life after I was discharged was strange. The town I had called home for 5 years suddenly felt hostile. People I knew would see me in the grocery store and abruptly turn their carts down another aisle, their faces averted. A coworker I'd considered a friend mentioned offhandedly that she'd heard from someone in Tessa's mommy group that I was milking the accident for attention and money. Someone keyed a long, jagged scratch down the entire length of my car. My landlord called me into his office when I went to renew my lease, asking pointed, uncomfortable questions about whether I was involved in any legal issues that might negatively impact the building's reputation. I was adrift in a sea of whispers and cold shoulders, feeling like a pariah for reasons I couldn't begin to comprehend. Then the papers arrived. A process server, a man in a cheap suit with bored eyes, knocked on my door and handed me a thick envelope. I was being sued by Tessa and her husband, David, for defamation of character and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The legal document, full of dense, incomprehensible jargon, essentially claimed that I had fabricated a story of heroism and was spreading vicious lies about Tessa being a negligent mother. It alleged that these lies were systematically destroying her online parenting business and causing her and her family immense personal suffering. I remember sliding down my bathroom door and sitting on the cold tile, the papers scattered around me, just crying until I was gasping for air. The sheer, breathtaking injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. I couldn't afford a high-powered lawyer. I could barely make the co-pays for my burn treatments and the endless physical therapy sessions. My dominant hand was still a mess of scarred tissue, mostly useless, and I was only working part-time doing administrative tasks at the clinic. I was drowning in medical debt, and now I was facing a lawsuit from the very people whose child I had saved. The only ray of light in that whole dark, terrifying time was Mrs. Delaney. She was a sweet, sharp-as-a-tack old lady who lived across the street from the accident site and had seen the whole thing unfold from her front porch. She called me a few days after I got home from the hospital, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. She told me she saw Tessa on her phone, laughing and video chatting, right up until the moment she plowed her SUV into that tree. She saw me, a total stranger, run towards the smoke while Tessa, the mother, ran away. That woman is a menace and a liar, Mrs. Delaney had said, her voice firm. I'll tell anyone who will listen what really happened. She was my only witness, my only anchor to the truth in a world that had suddenly turned into a funhouse mirror. I managed to find a lawyer, a young guy just starting his own practice, who took my case for next to nothing because the story made his blood boil. While we were preparing my defense, he worked a small miracle and got his hands on the security footage from a wine bar down the street from the crash. And there it was, in glorious, damning high definition. Tessa, leaving the bar at noon on a Tuesday, stumbling slightly as she walked to her car, getting into the driver's seat while actively on a video call. The timestamp was just 3 minutes before the 911 call about the crash. Suddenly, her lawyers weren't so aggressive. The tone of their letters changed. They called my lawyer and proposed a settlement meeting. Their offer: I would have to sign a rock-solid non-disclosure agreement and issue a public apology for the misunderstanding that had caused the family so much pain. The meeting was held in one of those soul-crushing downtown conference rooms, all gray carpets and generic, depressing art. Tessa was there with her husband, David. He looked like a ghost. He was handsome, but all the color had drained from his face, and he seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive suit. He spent the entire meeting staring at his hands, which he had clasped on the polished table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Tessa, on the other hand, was the picture of bored indifference. She scrolled through Instagram on her phone, occasionally smirking at something, as if she were waiting for a brunch reservation, not negotiating the terms of a lawsuit she'd filed against the woman who had saved her child's life. I hadn't planned what happened next. I was supposed to be the quiet, grateful client and let the lawyers do the talking. But as I sat there, listening to her attorney, a man with a smug face and a tie that cost more than my rent, drone on about my obvious and troubling campaign of harassment, a rage I didn't even know I was capable of just boiled over. It was a pure, clean anger that burned away months of fear, pain, and confusion. I reached into my bag, pulled out the thick file my lawyer had prepared, and slapped it down on the table with a sound that made everyone jump. Let's talk about defamation, I said, my voice shaking but loud and clear in the quiet room. I opened the file and started laying out the evidence, one piece at a time, like a poker player revealing a royal flush. Here are the stills from the wine bar security footage, showing your client leaving just minutes before the crash, clearly intoxicated and on her phone. I pushed the glossy photos across the table. Here is the data we recovered from your client's car's black box, showing she was going 15 miles over the speed limit and never once touched the brakes. I slid the report over. Here is the sworn, notarized statement from Mrs. Delaney, who witnessed the entire event. Another sheet of paper. And here, I said, my voice dropping, are statements from 3 other mothers who were at the Mommy and Me brunch event with your client that morning, all of whom are willing to testify that she was drinking heavily from 10 a.m. onwards. Tessa's perfectly made-up face went the color of chalk. David looked like he was going to be physically sick, his face turning a pale shade of green. So here's my settlement offer, I said, leaning forward, making sure to look Tessa directly in the eye. You drop this ridiculous, insulting lawsuit. You pay every single one of my medical bills, past, present, and future. You reimburse me for every cent of my lost wages. You do all of that today, and this all stays in this room. You don't. I paused, letting the threat hang in the air, and I will make it my life's mission to ensure every single person in this town, every single one of your Blessed Mama blog followers, and every news station that will listen, knows that you are a drunk, negligent driver who almost killed her own child and then tried to ruin the life of the person who saved her. They paid. There was no more negotiation. They dropped the suit, and the money was wired to my account the very next day. I thought it was over. I was naive enough to believe that the truth and a little bit of righteous anger had won. I couldn't have been more wrong. That was 3 months ago. Life had started to feel normal again. My hand was getting better, slowly, but surely. The physical therapy was grueling, a special kind of hell to be a patient in the field you once practiced, but I was regaining dexterity. I was even working 4 days a week, actually treating patients again. I was at home that night, doing my painful stretching exercises on the living room floor when there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find David standing there. He looked even worse than he had in the conference room, like he hadn't slept or eaten in weeks. His eyes were bloodshot and circled with dark, bruised-looking rings. I'm so sorry to bother you, he said, his voice raspy and low. But I found something. I need your help. My first instinct was to slam the door in his face. The last thing I ever wanted was to be dragged back into the orbit of his toxic, manipulative wife. But he looked so broken, so utterly lost, that I hesitated. He held up his phone and showed me a series of screenshots from their doorbell camera, going back months. There was footage of Tessa stumbling out to the car in the morning, Bella trailing behind her, looking confused. There were videos of her backing into the mailbox, the garage door, just laughing it off. There was even a clip of her carrying what looked suspiciously like a mimosa in a travel mug out to the car at 8 in the morning on a weekday. I installed a small camera in her car last week, he said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. I had to know. Look at this. He played a video from the day before. It showed Tessa driving, swerving erratically between lanes, while Bella cried in the backseat. At one point, Tessa turned around, her face contorted with rage, and screamed at her to shut up while she rummaged through her purse for what she called her medicine. I need help, David said again, his eyes pleading with a desperation that was painful to watch. My lawyer says I need more evidence, a stronger case, if I want to get full custody of Bella. I need someone who knows what she's capable of. Someone a judge might actually believe. Will you help me? I just stared at him, at his desperate, haunted face, my own scarred hand involuntarily clenching into a fist, the tight, puckered skin pulling uncomfortably. He was asking me to willingly dive back into the nightmare that had almost destroyed me. He was confirming that the crash wasn't a one-time, tragic mistake. It was a pattern, a lifestyle. Tessa was a high-functioning alcoholic who was actively endangering her child every single day, all while curating a flawless image of perfect motherhood for her online followers. I noticed then that his wedding ring was gone, leaving a pale, untanned line of skin on his finger. I have to call my lawyer first, I said finally, the words feeling like gravel in my throat. I couldn't just say no. Not when I thought of Bella. Come in, but I need to make sure this won't detonate in my face. Again. He nodded eagerly, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes, and stepped inside my apartment. I closed the door, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. As I was scrolling through my phone's contacts, his own phone began to buzz incessantly, a rapid-fire machine gun of notifications that made us both jump. His face went as white as a sheet as he stared at the screen. Oh God, he whispered. It was Tessa. She had sent him a picture of him standing on my doorstep, a crystal-clear image taken from a camera I didn't know existed. The first text simply said, I know where you are. Then came a flood of threats, screenshots of faked, flirtatious text conversations between him and me, all designed to paint a picture of a sordid affair. The last one was a video of Bella, her face tear-streaked and puffy, asking in a small, coached voice, "Why did Daddy leave?" The timestamp on the video showed that it had been recorded 3 days ago. Tessa had been waiting for him to make a move. She had an arsenal of digital blackmail ready to deploy at a moment's notice. She had me, and by extension, David, completely trapped. If I let him stay, she would use the photos and the fabricated text to prove her narrative of me being a home-wrecking stalker, destroying any credibility I might have had. If I sent him away, he would go right back under her control, and she would have even more leverage over him, holding this visit over his head forever. She was playing a masterful game of chess while I was still trying to figure out the rules of checkers. "You need to go," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth.
Now.
"But leave the evidence. Leave the USB drive and the file." His face crumpled in defeat, but he knew I was right. There was no winning this move. He handed me the drive and the folder of documents and left, his shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of a deep and profound hopelessness. I watched from my window as he got into his car, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone as he began responding to her barrage of messages. The counterattack against me was immediate and brutal. Within 5 minutes, my boss, Dr. Martinez, called. "I've received some very concerning reports about your professional conduct," he said, his usually warm voice now cold and distant. Then my landlord, suddenly citing multiple complaints and lease violations regarding unregistered overnight guests. Then came a call from a blocked number that was just the sound of someone breathing heavily on the other end before they hung up. With trembling hands, I opened Facebook, and there it was, a fresh post on Tessa's Blessed Mama page. So heartbroken that the person who saved my sweet Bella is now actively trying to break up our family. Some people just can't let go of their hero complex. Prayers appreciated during this difficult time. She had posted one of the doorbell camera photos, and in the background, my apartment number was clearly and deliberately visible. The comment section was a tidal wave of support for her and pure, unadulterated vitriol for me. But the one that made my blood run cold was for my coworker, Catherine. I always knew something was off with her. "The way she talks about your family is honestly creepy. Stay strong, Mama." Tessa hadn't just been preparing for David. She had been systematically poisoning my entire life for months, turning friends and colleagues against me, one carefully placed whisper at a time. My phone buzzed again, a text from my clinic's scheduling service. Every single one of my patient appointments for the next day had been canceled. My phone rang again. It was Mrs. Delaney. "That woman, Tessa," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "She was just here. She offered to pay to have my entire house re-roofed if I would just reconsider my witness statement about the accident." I told her she didn't have to put herself at risk for me, that I understood, but it was worse than that. "She knew about my grandson's trouble with the police last year," Mrs. Delaney said, her voice cracking. "A juvenile charge. It was supposed to be sealed. She said it would be such a terrible shame if that information somehow got out." The line went dead. Tessa wasn't just defending herself anymore. This was a scorched earth campaign, and she was just getting started. The next morning, Dr. Martinez put me on indefinite voluntary leave. When I arrived at the clinic for the meeting, Tessa was already there, sitting in the waiting room with Bella on her lap. She had scheduled a therapy consultation for Bella in my usual morning time slot. It was all a performance. In front of a waiting room full of my own patients, she loudly proclaimed that I had become obsessed with her family since the accident, showing them carefully curated screenshots of the innocent. "How is Bella doing?" Texts I'd sent in the weeks after the crash, making them look like a pattern of incessant harassment. That afternoon, she officially filed a restraining order against me, using David's visit, the one she had so brilliantly orchestrated, as the primary evidence of my escalating and unstable behavior. The hearing was a joke. Her lawyer, a high-priced shark named Morrison, painted me as an unhinged, fixated stalker. He had photos of me visiting Mrs. Delaney's house, which he skillfully framed as blatant witness tampering. He had my work emails, which had been mysteriously hacked, showing faked, flirtatious exchanges between David and me. He had everything, and all of it was a lie, but it was a very convincing one. The judge granted the temporary restraining order without a second thought. I was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of Tessa or Bella. Since Tessa had now enrolled Bella in therapy at my clinic, I was effectively barred from my own workplace. I was completely and utterly cornered. I felt like I was losing my mind, which, I realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity, was her goal all along. During my initial HR intake at the clinic years ago, I had mentioned my own mother's lifelong struggles with mental illness. It was a footnote in my file, a piece of personal history I shared in confidence. It was also the deepest, most private fear I carried, the fear of ever being seen as unstable, of inheriting that same fragility. That information was in my employee file. Tessa, through her connections or by hacking, had accessed it. She had found my deepest vulnerability and had built her entire psychological warfare campaign around it. She wasn't just trying to silence me, she was trying to get me institutionalized. David managed to get a burner phone, and we met in a deserted, multi-story parking garage downtown. Ridiculously clandestine meeting that felt like something out of a spy movie. He looked like a ghost. He'd done some digging and found proof of Tessa's first DUI from her sophomore year in college. The case had been completely expunged because her powerful, wealthy father knew the judge. The other person in the car, her roommate at the time, a girl named Jennifer, had suffered minor injuries, transferred schools mid-semester, and essentially vanished shortly after the accident. Tessa's father had paid for her silence. It wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a pattern. Anyone who threatened Tessa's perfect image was either bought off or systematically destroyed. The final custody hearing felt like a foregone conclusion. The stolen grief story, where Tessa had been caught plagiarizing the blog posts of a mother whose child had died of cancer, had damaged her reputation in the community, but legally, it was just hearsay. The dash cam footage of Bella screaming in the car was expertly dismissed by a digital forensics expert as potentially doctored. And then the final blow. David's mother had died in the hospital from complications from her fall. The district attorney was now pursuing murder charges against David, based on a vial of insulin, which Tessa had obviously planted, found in his car during a search. In the courtroom, Tessa was the picture of tragic grace, a grieving daughter-in-law, a terrified mother trying to protect her child from her unstable, murderous husband and his obsessed stalker mistress. I was a convicted stalker, my professional license now permanently revoked. David was an accused murderer. We were the crazy ones. She was the victim. She had crafted the narrative so perfectly that the truth no longer mattered. The judge's decision was devastating but not surprising. David was remanded to custody to await his murder trial. I was given 2 years of probation for violating the restraining order. And Tessa? She was granted sole, unsupervised custody of Bella. She had won. She had taken my life, David's life, and her own daughter's future, and burned them all to the ground to protect her fragile edifice of lies. As they led me out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she caught my eye. She wasn't smiling. Her expression was completely empty, hollow. Because the game was over, and she had nothing left to play for. In the end, it wasn't another victim that brought her down. It was the very first one. My public defender, a young, tenacious woman who refused to believe the polished narrative Tessa had sold the court, had spent weeks trying to find her, Jennifer, the college roommate from that first DUI. And she did. Jennifer was living under a new name in a different state, still terrified of Tessa's family, but she had kept everything. Journals from that time, threatening emails from Tessa's father, and a scratchy but clear audio recording of a conversation where Tessa drunkenly admitted to causing the accident and laughed about how her father would make it all go away. But what broke the case wide open was something else entirely. Jennifer had suffered minor burns in that long-ago crash when the car's radiator had burst. And she had photos of them. The burn patterns on her arm were eerily, almost identically, similar to mine. Tessa didn't just have a pattern of destructive behavior. She had a signature. Presented with Jennifer's undeniable evidence, and faced with a new, high-profile investigation into her influential father's potential obstruction of justice, Tessa's carefully constructed world imploded. The dam of fear she had built around her victims finally broke. The stolen grief mothers, Mrs. Delaney, my former co-workers, even the nurse from the hospital who had seen Tessa near David's mother's room, they all came forward, no longer afraid to speak the truth. The case against David fell apart when security footage from the hospital, previously corrupted, was suddenly recovered, showing Tessa, not David, near his mother's room shortly before her death. Tessa, ever the pragmatist, took a plea deal to avoid a trial that would have exposed every last one of her monstrous secrets. She was sentenced to 10 years in a state prison for a laundry list of charges ranging from perjury and stalking to felony child endangerment and the attempted murder of David's mother. Her father was also indicted on multiple charges of obstruction and witness tampering. David was fully exonerated and granted sole custody of Bella. I didn't feel victorious. There was no joy, no sense of triumph in watching her being led away in handcuffs. There were only victims left standing in the rubble of the lives she had torched. I lost my career, my savings, and my fundamental sense of safety in the world. David lost his mother and 2 years of his life to a legal nightmare. And Bella lost her mother and now has years of therapy ahead of her to process the unimaginable trauma of her early childhood. My probation was terminated and my criminal record was fully expunged, but I knew I could never go back to being a physical therapist. The puckered, discolored scars on my arm were a constant, aching reminder of how quickly and completely a life could be broken. So I went back to school. I'm studying to be a victim's advocate now, specializing in cases of psychological abuse and narcissistic manipulation. I want to be the person I needed when my life was falling apart. I see David and Bella sometimes at the park near my new, much smaller apartment. He looks older, tired, but the haunted look is finally gone from his eyes. Bella is a quiet child, but she's smiling again. The other day, she ran up to me and shyly handed me a drawing she'd made in her therapy session. It was of a firefighter pulling a little girl with blonde hair from a burning car. Underneath, in wobbly, crayon letters, she had written, "My hero." And for the first time in a very, very long time, I didn't feel like a victim, a stalker, or a fool. I just felt like I was finally healing. The war is over, and we survived. And for now, that's more than enough.